The rain hammered against the cracked window of the basement apartment like 1,000 tiny fists, reminding him of every failure, every whispered insult, every door that had slammed in his face. In the darkness, with nothing but the glow of a dying phone battery and the weight of tomorrow's rent notice on the table beside him, Marcus sat on the edge of a mattress that had long ago lost its shape, staring at hands that trembled not from cold, but from the crushing realization that maybe, just maybe, everyone had been right about him all along. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't see in that moment, was that the darkest hour comes just before something breaks open inside a man's chest and rewrites the entire story. 3 years earlier, Marcus had stood in the marble lobby of Henderson Financial, wearing a suit borrowed from his cousin, and shoes he'd polished 7 times until they almost looked new. The interview had gone well, or so he thought, until he'd overheard 2 executives by the elevator laughing about the kid from the South Side who actually believed he had what it took to make it in their world. One of them had said it loud enough for Marcus to hear, like he wasn't even worth the discretion of a whisper. The guy comes in here with community college on his resume and dreams in his eyes like that's gonna pay the bills. The other had responded with a smirk that Marcus would remember for years. Some people just aren't built for this level. Better he learns now than wastes everyone's time. Marcus had walked out of that building with his head down, his borrowed suit suddenly feeling like a costume, like he'd been playing dress-up in a world that would never accept him. He'd taken the bus home, watching the city transform from glass towers to crumbling brick, from people in tailored coats to people hunched against the wind, and he'd felt the familiar weight settle back onto his shoulders. The weight that said he was foolish for trying. The weight that said his mother had cleaned office buildings for 20 years so he could have a chance. But chances were for other people, people with the right last names and the right connections, and the right schools on their transcripts. But Marcus had gone home that night and done something that surprised even himself. Instead of giving up, instead of accepting what they'd said about him, he'd opened his laptop, the one with the cracked screen and the battery that only worked when plugged in, and he'd started learning. Not because he was trying to prove them wrong, not yet anyway, but because there was something burning in his chest that refused to go out, some small flame that had survived every attempt to extinguish it. He'd found free courses online, tutorials on financial modeling, videos on market analysis, forums where people who'd made it from nothing shared their knowledge with people still climbing. For 6 months, Marcus worked the night shift at a warehouse, stacking boxes from midnight to 8 in the morning, then came home to study until his eyes blurred and his head throbbed. He slept 4 hours a day. He stopped seeing friends. He stopped going out. His girlfriend left him, saying she couldn't watch him kill himself chasing something that would never happen. She'd stood in his doorway with tears in her eyes and told him that loving him hurt too much when he clearly didn't love himself enough to know when to quit. The door had closed, and Marcus had stood there in the silence, wondering if she was right, wondering if persistence was just another word for delusion. His mother would call every Sunday, her voice tired from her own week of work, and she'd ask if he was eating enough, if he was taking care of himself. He'd lie and say yes, not mentioning the ramen noodles that had become his primary diet, or the way his clothes hung looser on his frame. She'd tell him she was proud of him, and those words would land in his chest like stones, heavy with the weight of her sacrifice. She'd worked 2 jobs after his father left, had missed his school plays and basketball games, had worn the same winter coat for 15 years so he could have new textbooks. And here he was, her investment, working a warehouse job and chasing a dream that everyone said was impossible. The city had a way of swallowing people like Marcus. He'd seen it happen to his neighbors, to his classmates, to his own brother who'd started with big plans and ended up just another face in the crowd, working to survive, surviving to work. There was a rhythm to it, a resignation that settled into people's shoulders, a look in their eyes that said they'd tried once and learned their lesson. The city didn't want people to rise. It wanted them to stay where they were, to accept their place, to stop disturbing the order of things. But every night, as Marcus walked home from the warehouse with the sunrise painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, he'd pass by that same building where he'd been rejected, and he'd feel that fire flicker a little brighter. He'd taught himself Python and SQL. He'd mastered Excel functions that made spreadsheets dance. He'd read every book he could find on market trends and investment strategies, absorbing information like a man dying of thirst. He'd built models in his spare time, tracking stocks, predicting movements, getting it wrong more often than right at first, but learning from every failure. 1 year after that rejection, Marcus had applied to 27 different positions. He'd gotten 26 rejections and 1 interview. The interview was with a small firm in a part of town that didn't have marble lobbies or executives in $1,000 suits. The owner, a man named Richard Chen, who'd started his company in his garage 15 years prior, had looked at Marcus's resume with its community college education and warehouse job and asked a single question. Why should I take a chance on you when I could hire someone from an Ivy League school? Marcus had looked him in the eye and said something he'd never planned to say, something that came from that burning place in his chest. Because those Ivy League kids have never had to choose between eating and learning. They've never stayed up for 48 hours straight because they had to work and study, and there weren't enough hours for both. They're smart, but I'm hungry, and hunger is what builds empires. Richard had smiled, a small crack in his serious expression, and said, "Start Monday." The job paid barely more than the warehouse, but it was a foot in the door, a chance to prove what he'd been teaching himself in the dark hours of the morning. Marcus worked like a man possessed, arriving before everyone else, leaving after they'd all gone home. He took on projects no one else wanted, crunched numbers until patterns emerged from chaos, made recommendations that his colleagues dismissed as the overenthusiasm of someone too green to know better. But 3 months in, one of his recommendations hit. A small company he'd flagged as undervalued got acquired, and the firm made a profit that turned heads. Richard had called Marcus into his office, and for a moment Marcus had thought he was being fired for overstepping. Instead, Richard had asked, "What else do you see?" For the next year, Marcus became known as the kid with the instinct, the guy who could spot opportunities in places others overlooked. His success rate wasn't perfect, nobody's was, but it was good enough that people started listening. The firm grew. Marcus's salary grew. He moved out of the basement apartment into a place with windows that didn't leak and a bed that didn't sag in the middle. He sent money home to his mother, enough that she could finally quit one of her jobs. But success had a way of bringing out something ugly in people. The colleagues who'd ignored Marcus when he first started now watched him with narrow eyes and tight smiles. They'd make comments in the break room about affirmative action, about lucky guesses, about how connections must have gotten him the job. They'd never say it to his face, not directly, but Marcus heard the whispers. He saw the looks. He felt the weight of their resentment like a physical thing. One of them, a guy named Brandon who'd graduated from Yale and never let anyone forget it, had cornered Marcus in the hallway one evening when most people had gone home. He'd smiled that particular smile that wasn't really a smile at all and said, "You know this can't last, right? Whatever lucky streak you're on, it's gonna run out, and when it does, you'll be right back where you started. This world, it has rules, and people like you don't get to rewrite them just because you worked hard. Everybody works hard. The difference is some of us were built for this." Marcus had stood there, feeling 15 years old again, feeling like the kid who didn't belong, and for a moment he'd almost believed it. Almost. But then he'd remembered his mother's hands, worn rough from years of cleaning supplies and hard work. He'd remembered the executives laughing by the elevator. He'd remembered every person who'd ever looked at him, and decided he wasn't enough before he'd even opened his mouth. And instead of shrinking, instead of accepting Brandon's words as truth, Marcus had looked him dead in the eye and said, "Watch me." The following month, Marcus made a call that would change everything. He'd been tracking a tech startup that everyone in the industry had written off as dead money. The company had failed to meet projections, their CEO had resigned, and the smart money was pulling out. But Marcus saw something in their patents, in their underlying technology, something that suggested the company wasn't dying but transforming. He'd spent 3 weeks building a model, running scenarios, wargaming every possible outcome. And then he'd walked into Richard's office and recommended they invest heavily. Richard had listened, his face unreadable, and then he'd asked the question that every investor fears. What if you're wrong? Marcus had felt his heart hammering in his chest, felt the weight of everything riding on this moment. If he was wrong, if he'd miscalculated, it wouldn't just hurt the firm. It would confirm what people like Brandon believed, that Marcus had been lucky, not skilled, and that his luck had finally run out. But Marcus had done the work. He'd checked and rechecked. He'd looked at this from every angle. So he'd taken a breath and said, "Then I'm wrong, but I'm not." The firm invested. For 2 months, nothing happened. The stock continued its downward slide. Marcus stopped sleeping well again. He'd see Brandon's smirk in the office, see the doubt creeping into Richard's eyes, feel the familiar weight of impending failure. His colleagues stopped asking for his input on projects. The invitations to after-work drinks dried up. He was becoming invisible again, fading back into the background where people like him were supposed to stay. Marcus would walk through the city during his lunch breaks, past the building where he'd first been rejected, and he'd wonder if coming back to this part of town was some kind of cosmic joke. Maybe he was always meant to be here, on the outside looking in, close enough to see success but never close enough to touch it. He'd think about his mother, about the pride in her voice when she told her friends her son worked in finance. He'd think about the warehouse workers he used to stack boxes with, guys who'd told him he was stupid for leaving a sure thing. He'd think about his ex-girlfriend and wonder if she'd been right, if knowing when to quit was actually the smarter choice. Then one morning, Marcus woke up to 17 missed calls. His heart had dropped, certain this was it. The call telling him the investment had imploded and taken his career with it. He'd called Richard back with shaking hands, and Richard's voice had come through the phone vibrating with an emotion Marcus couldn't immediately identify. Turn on the news. The tech company had announced a partnership with one of the largest manufacturers in the world. Their technology, the same technology everyone had dismissed, was being integrated into a product line that would reach millions of consumers. The stock had opened up 42% and was still climbing. In a single day, the firm's investment had tripled. By the end of the week, it had quadrupled. Marcus had made Richard Chen's firm more money in 3 months than they'd made in the previous 2 years. The office had gone quiet when Marcus walked in that Monday. Not the hostile quiet of resentment, but the stunned quiet of people having to recalibrate everything they thought they knew. Brandon had walked past without making eye contact. Other colleagues had offered congratulations that sounded like they were being pulled from their throats with pliers. Richard had called Marcus into his office and offered him a partnership. But here's what the movies don't tell you about success. It doesn't erase the journey. It doesn't make you forget the nights you went to bed hungry or the mornings you woke up wondering if today was the day you'd finally break. Success doesn't heal those wounds. It just proves you survived them. Marcus had stood in Richard's office, looking at the partnership offer, and instead of feeling triumphant, he'd felt tired. Bone deep, soul weary, tired. He'd accepted the partnership because of course he had. This was everything he'd worked for. But that night, alone in his apartment that no longer leaked when it rained, Marcus had sat on his couch and cried. Not tears of joy, but tears of release, of finally letting go of the weight he'd been carrying. He'd cried for the kid who'd walked out of that marble lobby with his head down. He'd cried for his mother's worn hands and his father's absence. He'd cried for every person who'd ever been told they weren't enough and believed it. The next morning, Marcus had done something that surprised everyone, including himself. He'd called the community college where he'd gotten his degree and offered to teach a free evening course on financial literacy and investing. Not for the credit, not for the resume line, but because he remembered what it felt like to be hungry for knowledge and too broke to afford the feast. The class had filled up in 3 hours. 67 students, most of them working full-time jobs, most of them from neighborhoods like the one Marcus grew up in, all of them hungry. That first night of class, Marcus had looked out at those faces and seen himself repeated 67 times. He'd seen the hope and the fear, the exhaustion and the determination, and he'd told them something he'd never planned to say. They're going to tell you that you don't belong. They're going to make you feel like success is a club you'll never have the right membership card for. They're going to whisper when you walk by and laugh when you leave. And you know what? You're going to let them. Not because they're right, but because you're too busy working to waste energy proving them wrong. You're going to take every rejection and use it as fuel. You're going to turn every closed door into a reason to build your own entrance. And one day, you're going to walk past the people who counted you out, and you won't even notice them anymore, because you'll be too focused on where you're going to waste time remembering where they tried to keep you. The students had erupted in applause, but Marcus had held up his hand. Save it. Applause is cheap. I don't want your applause. I want your success. I want you to take what you learn here and build something that scares you. I want you to dream so big that you wake up in the middle of the night sweating. And when you make it, when you finally break through, I want you to reach back and pull someone else up. That's the only applause that matters. Over the next 2 years, Marcus's partnership flourished. He became known not just for his instincts, but for his integrity. He hired people from non-traditional backgrounds, from community colleges and state schools, from neighborhoods that typically fed workers into warehouses and retail stores, not boardrooms and trading floors. He built a team of hungry, brilliant people who'd been overlooked by everyone else. And together, they rewrote the rules. But the city remembers. It always remembers. 5 years after that first rejection, Marcus found himself walking through the marble lobby of Henderson Financial. Not as an applicant this time, but as the representative of a firm that Henderson wanted to partner with. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd been invited back to the building that had once made him feel like he was pretending to be something he could never become. The same executives who'd laughed by the elevator were in the conference room. They were older now, grayer, but they had the same look in their eyes. The look that said they owned the room and everyone in it. They didn't recognize Marcus. Why would they? He'd been nobody to them, not worth remembering. But Marcus recognized them. He'd never forgotten their faces, their voices, the casual cruelty of their dismissal. The meeting had gone well. Marcus's firm had everything Henderson needed. The partnership would be lucrative for both sides. As they were wrapping up, signing preliminary agreements, one of the executives had made small talk, asking Marcus where he'd gone to school. Marcus had smiled, that small smile that comes from knowing something others don't, and said, "Community college, right here in the city." The executive had laughed, thinking it was a joke. When he'd realized Marcus was serious, his smile had faltered. He'd looked confused, like the world had tilted slightly off its axis. "But how did you—" Marcus had stood, gathering his papers, and he'd looked at both executives, really looked at them. "I came here 5 years ago for an interview. I overheard you two by the elevator. You said some people just aren't built for this level. You said I'd waste everyone's time." The room had gone very quiet. "And you know what? You were right. I wasn't built for your level. I was built for something higher." He'd walked out of that building for the second time, but this time his head was high. His suit was his own, and his shoes were polished not out of desperation, but out of respect for how far he'd come. The rejection that had once felt like the end of his story had actually been the beginning of a different one, a better one where the main character wasn't defined by other people's limitations. Marcus's mother had retired the following year. He'd bought her a house with a garden where she could grow tomatoes and roses, where she could sit on a porch that didn't face a busy street, where she could rest her worn hands and know that her sacrifice had meant something. The day they'd moved her in, she'd hugged him for a long time, and when she'd pulled back, there were tears in her eyes. She touched his face the way she used to when he was a child and said, "I always knew. Even when you didn't, I always knew." What they don't tell you about rising from nothing is that nothing is never really nothing. It's your mother's sacrificed dreams and your own sleepless nights. It's the hunger that taught you to appreciate food, and the cold that taught you to value warmth. It's every person who underestimated you giving you fuel for the fire. Nothing is actually everything you need to become something, if you're willing to burn hot enough and long enough. Today, Marcus runs his own firm. It's not the biggest in the city, but it's known for something more valuable than size. It's known for taking chances on people everyone else has written off. It's known for building futures instead of just managing money. And every person who walks through his door, every kid from a neighborhood that's supposed to produce workers, not leaders, every dreamer with community college on their resume and fire in their chest, Marcus sees himself. He still teaches that evening class, even though he doesn't need to. He shows up every week because he remembers what hope felt like when it was the only thing he owned. He remembers the darkness of that basement apartment and the weight of tomorrow's rent notice. He remembers the executives by the elevator and his ex-girlfriend's tears and Brandon's sneer. He remembers all of it, not because he's bitter, but because he's grateful. Every rejection carved him into someone capable of handling success. Every closed door taught him to build better entrances. Every person who said he'd never rise gave him another reason to prove that rise doesn't ask for permission. The rain still falls on the city, hammering against windows, reminding people of their failures and their fears. But somewhere in that city, right now, there's someone sitting in a basement apartment with a cracked phone screen and a dying battery. Someone staring at their trembling hands and wondering if everyone was right about them. And if Marcus could speak to that person, if he could reach through time and space and touch that moment of doubt, he'd say this: "Let them be right. Let them think you'll never make it. Let them whisper and laugh and dismiss you. Because while they're wasting energy convincing themselves of your failure, you'll be too busy building your success to notice. The silence before glory isn't empty. It's full of every sacrifice you're making that no one sees, every skill you're learning in the dark, every moment you choose to keep going when quitting would be easier. That silence is loud with the sound of your becoming. And when you finally rise, when you finally break through, they won't be able to imagine how you did it. Not because it's impossible, but because they stopped watching. They counted you out so early that they missed the entire transformation. So let them say you'll never rise again. Then rise anyway, not to prove them wrong, but to prove yourself right. Because you were never rising for them. You were rising for you, for your mother's worn hands, for every person who sacrificed so you could have a chance, for every future version of yourself that refused to accept their limitations as your ceiling. Rise because silence always comes before glory, and you've been silent long enough. What have they told you that you can't do? I want to know. Drop it in the comments below. Tell me where in the world you're watching this from, what dream you're chasing that everyone says is impossible. And if this story hit you somewhere deep, if it reminded you why you started, do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel. Leave a like. Not for the algorithm, though that helps, but as a promise to yourself that you're not giving up. Because every person who's ever risen from nothing started exactly where you are right now, in that moment between doubt and determination. And they made a choice. Make yours. Silence always comes before glory, and your silence is almost over.